Hey there, students. This is Mr. Washington, and it's time for another video lesson. In today's video, we're going to be reviewing the different types of conflict that can be found in a work of fiction. Life is filled with conflict, and stories are no exceptions. In fact, one of the main reasons we read stories, or watch them or listen to them, is because we want to know what the problem was and how it got solved. There was a fight. How did it end? Somebody broke a rule. What were the consequences? There's a natural part of us that wants to know all bad things eventually get better, that conflicts get resolved. So this video is going to help us determine how we define a conflict and how we can classify conflicts when we see them in a work of literature. Let's get started. To begin, all great stories must have conflict.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Without conflict, the story really wouldn't be worth reading. With most stories, the whole purpose of reading the story is to see what problems the main character faces and to see how he or she resolves those problems. No problems, no story. So let's begin by defining conflict. A conflict is a problem or struggle in a story between the protagonist and an opposing force, which will be referred to as an antagonist. Conflicts are generally written as listing the protagonist versus the antagonist to show the oppositional relationship between the two. There are two main types of conflict that we want to be familiar with. The first type of conflict is called an external conflict. An external conflict is a conflict between a character and an outside force. The other type of conflict is called an internal conflict. Internal conflict is when the protagonist is struggling with something in his or her own mind. Now that we've defined conflict, let's take a look at some examples. Let's take a closer look at external conflict. External conflict is defined as a conflict that takes place between a character and an outside force, and will probably look something like this, with a character engaged in some sort of problem with a force outside of himself or herself. There are 5 main external conflicts that we want to be familiar with. The first type of external conflict can be described as an individual versus individual conflict. The second type of external conflict is described as individual versus nature. The third is described as individual versus society. The fourth is described as individual versus the supernatural. And the fifth and final type of external conflict is described as individual versus technology. When we look at these 5 descriptions, notice what each of them has in common. They all begin with the word individual, which can sometimes be interchanged with other words such as character, as in character versus character, character versus nature, etc. Notice also the word versus, abbreviated as VS. The word versus is important because it helps explain the two sides that are engaged in the conflict, usually the protagonist and the antagonist. When describing a conflict, it is a good idea to use the word or abbreviation for versus because it helps you clearly identify the two sides of the conflict. Now that we've given them all a name, let's take a look at some examples of external conflict in works of fiction in the world around us. So our first type of external conflict is called an individual versus individual conflict. This is a conflict that takes place between 2 or more characters. An example might be Harry Potter versus He Who Will Not Be Named in the Harry Potter series. Our next type of external conflict is called an individual versus nature conflict. This is defined as a conflict that takes place between a character and a force of nature. A force of nature can be anything from an animal to a storm to a natural disaster and can be found in all sorts of literature and movies and films. Our example comes from a movie from the year 2000 called Castaway, starring Tom Hanks. In Castaway, Tom Hanks' character Chuck is stranded on a desert island and has to struggle to stay alive for 4 years. Let's take a Our third type of external conflict is an individual versus society conflict. This is defined as a conflict that happens between a character and the laws within a community or a society. An example might be the Rosa Parks story. In this case, Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to obey an unjust law. As a result of that conflict, the laws surrounding segregation in the South would eventually change. This is an individual versus society conflict. Our fourth type of external conflict is individual versus the supernatural. This type of conflict is defined as a conflict that occurs between a character and a supernatural force, such as werewolves, vampires, and other types of things that don't exist in the natural world. An example might be from the horror movie Annabelle, in which a creepy doll terrorizes a married couple. Individual versus supernatural. Our fifth and final type of external conflict is the individual versus technology. This is defined as a conflict that occurs between a character and a machine or technological force. An example might be The Matrix, starring Keanu Reeves. In The Matrix, the main character Neo fights against the agents of the Matrix, which is everything from machines to computer programs to robots. There are many types of individual versus technology conflicts. Individual versus technology. Not all conflicts are external. There's another type of conflict called an internal conflict. An internal conflict is a conflict that happens within the mind of a character. If we were to see an internal conflict, it might look something like this. Unlike external conflicts, which have many different types, there is only one way of describing an internal conflict, and that is the individual versus self. Individual versus self conflicts can be very difficult to show because they're happening inside of the mind of a character, but TV shows and movies often find creative ways to show us what's going on inside a character's head. Our example comes from the Disney movie The Emperor's New Groove. One of the characters, Kronk, has to make a decision whether to save a character or to let him perish. That concludes our lesson on the different types of conflict. I hope you've learned a lot and I hope you took good notes. Now as you read, see if you can identify some of the different conflicts your characters may be facing. Thanks for tuning in.